The millionaire freezes as he recognizes his long-lost love in the waitress, missing for 18 years. The sight shocks him to his core. It was an ordinary evening for everyone else in the upscale restaurant, where the hum of conversations blended seamlessly with the gentle clinking of glasses and the soft melodies played by the pianist. For Alexander Gray, however, the moment felt anything but ordinary. The world around him seemed to blur, his breath hitching in his chest as he stared at the woman setting a steaming cup of coffee on the table a few feet away. Time had etched its subtle changes on her face, but there was no mistaking the depth of those green eyes, the softness of her expression, or the graceful way she moved. It was her. It had to be her. Claire. The name escaped his lips before he could stop himself, a whisper drowned out by the ambient noise. The waitress paused, her back still to him. For a fleeting second, he wondered if she had heard him, if some invisible thread had tugged at her memory the way it had unraveled his. But she simply moved on, her attention shifting to another table as she took their orders with a gentle smile. Alexander's mind raced. Claire had vanished from his life without a trace 18 years ago, leaving behind an aching void and questions that haunted his every waking moment. He had scoured cities, hired private investigators, and even turned to media outlets in desperation, but every lead dissolved into nothingness. He had eventually forced himself to stop searching, to move on. And yet here she was, no longer the vibrant young artist who painted dreams into reality, but a waitress in a small, quaint restaurant. "Sir, is everything all right?" The voice of his dinner companion, a potential business partner, jolted him back to the present. The man raised an eyebrow, concern flickering across his face. Alexander barely registered the question. His focus remained on Claire as she worked, her hair tied back in a loose bun, her hands moving with quiet efficiency. "I need a moment," he muttered, rising abruptly from his seat. His companion looked puzzled, but Alexander was already weaving through the tables, his polished shoes silent against the tiled floor. Each step brought him closer, yet doubt and hesitation clawed at him. Was it truly her? What if he had mistaken a stranger for the woman who once meant the world to him? And if it was her, why hadn't she come back? When he reached her, she was balancing a tray of desserts, her attention focused on delivering them to another table. "Excuse me," he said, his voice firm but laced with a vulnerability he couldn't hide. She turned to face him. The tray nearly slipped from her hands as her eyes met his. There was a flicker of recognition, a momentary crack in the composed facade she wore. For a heartbeat, the world around them seemed to fade. "Alexander," she whispered, her voice barely audible. His name on her lips felt like a bomb and a blade all at once. "It's you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Claire, where have you been? Why did you leave?" Her face paled, and she glanced around, as if fearing that the entire restaurant might be eavesdropping. I'm working. I can't do this here." But Alexander wasn't willing to let her slip away again. "Please, just a moment. You owe me that much." Her eyes softened with regret, but she nodded, motioning for him to follow her. She led him to a small corridor near the kitchen, where the noise of the restaurant faded into the background. The air between them was thick with unspoken words and years of longing. "Why?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Why did you disappear? I looked everywhere for you." "I thought," he broke off, unable to finish the thought that had haunted him for years. Claire's hands trembled as she clutched her apron. "It's complicated, Alexander." "Complicated?" he echoed, the frustration and hurt spilling over. "You disappeared without a trace. No note, no explanation. Do you have any idea what that did to me?" Tears welled in her eyes, and she looked away, as if gathering her strength. "I didn't have a choice." "You always have a choice," he countered. "Whatever it was, we could have faced it together. That's what we promised each other." Her gaze returned to his, filled with a sorrow so profound that it made his heart ache. "Some choices aren't about what we want. They're about survival." Alexander froze, the weight of her words sinking in. He had always imagined grand, tragic reasons for her disappearance, a tragic accident, a life-threatening illness. But the raw pain in her voice hinted at something far more harrowing. "What happened to you, Claire?" he asked softly. She hesitated, and for a moment, He thought she wouldn't answer. But then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "If I tell you, you might wish you never found me." Alexander reached for her hand. His touch gentle but firm. "I've waited 18 years for answers. Nothing you say could make me wish I hadn't found you." Claire searched his face, her resolve crumbling as she saw the sincerity in his eyes. "Not here," she said finally. "Not tonight. If you still want the truth, meet me tomorrow at the park. Sunset. By the fountain." Alexander nodded, his chest tightening as she stepped away. He wanted to demand answers right then and there, but he could see the fragility in her posture, the storm of emotions threatening to consume her. As she walked back into the bustling restaurant, he remained in the corridor, his mind a whirlwind of questions. Who had Claire become in the years they were apart? What had she endured? And most importantly, would he ever be able to bridge the chasm of time and pain that lay between them? The next day, Alexander arrived at the park long before sunset. The fountain stood as it always had, a gentle cascade of water catching the golden hues of the setting sun. This place held memories, ones he thought he'd never revisit. It was where they had first confessed their love, where they dreamed of a life together. Now, those dreams felt distant, as if belonging to someone else entirely. He paced the path surrounding the fountain, his polished shoes crunching against the gravel. The hours felt like days, his mind replaying the moment he saw her again. The weight of her words, her pain, her fear, lingered like a specter. Just as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, he saw her. Claire approached slowly, her steps hesitant, as if the weight of the world rested on her shoulders. She was dressed simply, in jeans and a loose sweater, her hair tied back in a low ponytail. Yet, to Alexander, she radiated a beauty that no time or circumstance could diminish. "You came," she said softly, stopping a few feet away. "I told you I would," he replied, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling within him. She motioned toward a bench near the fountain, and they sat down, the space between them charged with unspoken truths. "I don't know where to start," Claire admitted after a moment, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. "Start with the truth," Alexander said, his tone gentle but firm. "Whatever it is, I need to know." Claire took a deep breath, her gaze fixed on the rippling water of the fountain. 18 years ago, I was in trouble, Alexander. Trouble I didn't know how to escape. "What kind of trouble?" he asked, leaning closer. She hesitated, her hands trembling. "Do you remember when I told you about my brother, Mark?" Alexander nodded. He vaguely remembered her mentioning a younger brother who had always been reckless, drawn to the wrong crowd. "He got involved with some dangerous people," Claire continued. "I thought I could help him, that I could pull him out before things got worse. But I didn't realize how deep he was until it was too late." Her voice cracked, and she paused to steady herself. Alexander waited, his heart aching for the pain she had carried alone for so long. "They came after him, demanding money he didn't have. I tried to negotiate, to reason with them, but they weren't the kind of people you reason with." She swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "When they couldn't find him, they came after me instead." Alexander's jaw tightened, a surge of anger rising within him. "They threatened you?" She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "They told me they'd hurt you if I didn't pay them. They knew about us, Alexander. They knew everything. I couldn't let them touch you, so I ran." The words hit him like a freight train. He stared at her, struggling to process the magnitude of what she had just revealed. "Claire, why didn't you come to me? We could have faced it together. I would have done anything to protect you." "You don't understand," she said, her voice rising slightly. "These weren't ordinary criminals. They had connections, power. If I stayed, if I involved you, they would have destroyed you. I couldn't live with that." Alexander leaned back, his mind reeling. He had always imagined that her disappearance was a choice, a cruel decision to leave him behind. But now, he saw the truth. She had sacrificed everything to protect him. "How did you survive?" he asked after a long silence. "I left the city, changed my name, and started over," she said. I worked odd jobs, kept my head down. Eventually, they stopped looking for me. Or maybe they just found someone else to chase. She shook her head, her expression filled with regret. I've been running ever since. The pain in her voice was almost unbearable. Alexander reached for her hand. His touch gentle but firm. You didn't have to face it alone, Claire. You still don't. Her eyes met his, a flicker of hope mingling with doubt. I don't know if I can stop running, Alexander. I've lived in fear for so long. I don't even know who I am anymore. You're the woman I fell in love with, he said, his voice unwavering. The woman who sacrificed everything to protect the people she cared about. That's who you are, Claire. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to lean into him, to feel the warmth and safety of his embrace. For a while, they sat in silence, the fountain's gentle cascade providing the only soundtrack to their reunion. But Alexander knew this was only the beginning. I'll help you, Claire, he said, his voice resolute. Whatever it takes, we'll face it together. You're not alone anymore. She pulled back, her eyes searching his face. Are you sure? This isn't just about me, Alexander. If they're still out there, they could come after you too. I'm not afraid, he said firmly. I've spent 18 years building walls around my heart, pretending I could move on without you. But now that I've found you, I'm not letting you go. Her lips trembled, a tentative smile breaking through her tears. I don't deserve this, Alexander. I don't deserve you. You deserve more than you've ever been given, he replied. And I'll spend the rest of my life proving it to you. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the park in a soft twilight, Claire allowed herself to believe in the possibility of a new beginning. For the first time in years, she felt the faint stirrings of hope, a fragile yet powerful thing. And as Alexander held her hand, he silently vowed that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he would stand by her side. The following days brought a whirlwind of emotions for both Claire and Alexander. After their meeting at the park, she reluctantly agreed to let him help her confront the shadows of her past. The prospect terrified her, but Alexander's steadfast determination gave her a glimmer of courage she hadn't felt in years. For Alexander, the time since their reunion was a blur of sleepless nights and meticulous planning. He reached out to trusted contacts, security experts, private investigators, and legal advisors, without revealing too much of Claire's situation. Though he had risen to wealth and prominence through his sharp business acumen, this felt different. This wasn't about deals or profits. It was about reclaiming a piece of his life he thought he'd lost forever. But Claire's fear remained palpable. As they sat in the warmth of his private library one evening, surrounded by towering shelves of books and the crackling fire casting shadows across the room, she voiced her deepest concern. Alexander, what if this stirs everything up again? She asked, her hands wrapped tightly around a mug of tea. What if they come back? Alexander leaned forward, his expression serious but calm. That's exactly why we need to take action. If they're still out there, hiding and running won't protect you forever. It's time to bring this to light. She sighed, her shoulders sagging. I've spent so long being invisible. The thought of stepping into the spotlight, it terrifies me. You won't be alone, he assured her. Whatever happens, we face it together. Claire met his gaze, the intensity of his conviction both reassuring and overwhelming. Slowly, she nodded. Okay, where do we start? The first step was to find out if the people who had hunted her were still a threat. Alexander hired a renowned private investigator, a sharp-witted woman named Evelyn Kane, who had a reputation for uncovering the truth no matter how deeply it was buried. Evelyn arrived at Alexander's estate a few days later, carrying a sleek briefcase and an air of quiet authority. She listened intently as Claire recounted her story in painstaking detail, the threats, her desperate flight, and the years of running. When Claire finished, Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her sharp blue eyes thoughtful. It's a complex situation, she said, but not impossible. The first thing we need to do is identify who these people are and whether they're still active. Alexander nodded. What do you need from us? Access to any information Claire might have, names, locations, even vague memories of conversations. And I'll need discretion. If these people are as dangerous as they sound, They won't appreciate us digging into their affairs." Claire hesitated, her mind racing. "There's one name," she said finally. "Marcus Hayes. He was their leader, the one who gave the orders." Evelyn jotted the name down. "That's a start. Leave it with me." As Evelyn left to begin her investigation, Alexander turned to Claire. "You did well," he said softly. "Giving her that name, it's a big step." Claire managed a weak smile. "I just hope it doesn't lead to more trouble." The following days were fraught with tension. Claire stayed at Alexander's estate, her modest belongings packed neatly into one of the guest rooms. Though she tried to keep herself busy, helping the housekeeper with small tasks or tending to the garden, her mind often wandered to dark places. Alexander, ever perceptive, noticed her unease. One afternoon, he found her sitting in the garden, staring blankly at a bed of blooming roses. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked, taking a seat beside her. She glanced at him, her expression distant. "I've been thinking about the person I used to be. Before all of this. I was so full of dreams, Alexander. I thought I could change the world with my art." "You still can," he said gently. She shook her head. "That person feels like a stranger now. I don't know if I'll ever find her again." Alexander reached for her hand, his touch grounding her. "You're still that person, Claire. She's been buried under years of fear and pain, but she's there. And I'll do everything I can to help you find her." Tears welled in her eyes, but this time, they weren't just tears of sadness. There was a glimmer of something else: hope. Days turned into weeks as Evelyn's investigation unfolded. She uncovered a trail that led to Marcus Hayes, who had managed to evade legal consequences for years thanks to his wealth and connections. However, Evelyn also discovered cracks in his armor, business dealings that skirted legality and allies who had grown disillusioned with his methods. The findings were both encouraging and alarming. Hayes was still a powerful man, but he wasn't invincible. "This is our chance," Evelyn told them during a meeting at the estate. "We can expose him, but we'll need to be strategic. Going public without solid evidence could backfire." Alexander's jaw tightened. "What kind of evidence do we need?" "Records of his dealings, testimonies from people who worked with him, anything that ties him to criminal activity," Evelyn replied. Claire listened silently, her heart pounding. The thought of confronting Hayes again filled her with dread, but she knew this was the only way to truly be free. "I'll help," she said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. "If it means putting an end to this, I'll do whatever it takes." The plan was set in motion. With Evelyn's guidance, they began gathering evidence, contacting former associates of Hayes who were willing to talk in exchange for protection. Claire's testimony became a critical piece of the puzzle, her memories shedding light on key details that Evelyn pieced together like a masterful mosaic. As the days passed, Claire felt a shift within herself. The fear that had once paralyzed her began to loosen its grip, replaced by a growing sense of purpose. She wasn't just fighting for her own freedom. She was fighting to bring justice to the countless others who had suffered at Hayes' hands. And through it all, Alexander stood by her side, his unwavering support a beacon of strength. Together, they faced each challenge, their bond growing deeper with each passing day. But as they drew closer to the truth, they knew the most dangerous chapter was yet to come.